Hey Chevra, what's happening? Welcome back to Babel on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nun Hey of Masechta Ayruvin 55. Daf Nun Hey talks about different shapes of cities that we're going to configure into 490-degree angles, like square, rectangle. We talked about a bow-shaped city, like imagine a city in the configuration of a bow, like a horseshoe kind of thing. Exciting stuff. Combining two adjacent cities to be one Tchum Shabbos. Exciting. And then huts. How do we deal with huts? Can a formation of huts be considered like a city? Well, I'm not going to tell you. You're just going to have to wait. Chevre. Let's begin on Daf Nun Hey Amud Aleph. About, 10 lines into the page by the two dots. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Ketzad ma'abrin es ha'orim. How do we sort of extend cities? Alright, so if you have a city and you want to determine what exactly is the limit of that city, that from there you would start calculating 2,000 amas for tchum. Arucha k'moshehi. Well, if it's just a rectangle, well, you leave it alone. Alright. Agula osun lazavios. If the city is round, well then you fill in the corners to make it square. Okay, meaning you add corners to it so that it's now square. If it's square, then you don't add corners. The Gemara is going to explain what's the chiddush there. So what if it was a trapezoid? So you basically have two parallel lines, but then you have two lines that are kind of on a crash course for each other. Almost imagine like a triangle that you clip off the top of it. So the top and the bottom lines are parallel, but the other two lines are going right at each other. So roin osa kilu hishave. So we view it as we basically fill it in to be a rectangle or a square, depending on how wide it is. Haya bayis echad yotze kimin pigum or shnei batim yotzin kimin shnei pigumin. Right, we talked about pigumin in the Mishnah. Those are like those guard towers. So if you have, let's say a wall of houses, and you have one of them jutting out, or two of them jutting out. So roin osan ki'ilu chut matuach alein. So you view it as if, so let's say you had two strings, let's say you had two houses jutting out of the wall. So you would imagine as if you would take a string and put it on the outside of one of those houses and extend it across all of the wall until you get to the other house and view all of that area as if it's filled in. I.e. basically extend the square to include the jutting out houses. Alright? And then we measure from outside of the larger square that can enclose both of those jutting out houses. So then we start measuring the 2,000 amos outside of that square. If the shape of the city was like a bow, or like a horseshoe bow, or like a gam. Gam is basically like this Greek letter, gamma, I guess, which is like kind of like a right angle. Alright. Yeah, it's imagine like a square, and then the north and east sides of the square, i.e. the top and the right sides of the square, or let's say like this, the left and the bottom sides of the square, just get rid of them. So you're left with the top and the right side of the square. That's what like this gam letter is. Ron osa ki'ilu himalaya batam achzeres. Well, then we basically fill in both of these shapes, whether it's the bow, whether it's the gam, you fill them in so that there'll be a square. And we view it as if all the open space is just filled with houses and chutzers. And then from that square, you would measure 2,000 amis around. Amar Mai, we said earlier, arucha kemos shehi. So if it's a rectangle, so then we just leave it alone. So pshita, that's obvious. Lo tzricha de aricha uktina. So what the Gemara is saying is that, yeah, but the chiddush is the fact that it's a rectangle. The fact that, one direction is longer than the other, right? Let's say it's, 10,000 amas wide, from left to right, from east to west, whatever, or technically from west to east, I guess. And then, what did I say? 10,000 amas wide, so 5,000 amas from north to south. So, ma'u de tema, I may have thought to say, litin la pusya orka Kamashmalan, I may have thought to say that, well, in that situation, you would make it square. You'd make it 10,000 amas by 10,000 amas, not 10,000 amas by 5,000 amas. So Kamashmalan, then no, we leave it alone. Once we get to a configuration where there are 4 right angles, 4 90-degree angles, so then we just leave it alone, even if it is rectangular rather than square. Mrubas in osin lazavius. So we said that if the city is square, well, then we leave it alone. We don't add corners. So pshita, obviously we're not going to add corners. What corners are you going to add? It already has 4 corners. It's a square. So l'tzricha de miraba filo miraba biribua olam. That's interesting. So it's talking about where, yeah, it's square, but it doesn't neatly fit into north, south, east, and west. Imagine, let's say you have a square city, and the top of the city is facing north, the bottom is facing south, the left is facing west, and the east and the right is facing east. Perfect, perfect directions. If you're looking towards the top of the city, it'll mamish be directly due north. But let's say you take that city and you rotate it 45 degrees. So now it is perfectly wrong. Like, if you look at the top of the city, your mamish can be going northeast, right? So in that case, we might think, well, that's a problem. We need things to be exactly due north, south, east, and west. So I might think that what you're going to do is you're going to expand, you're going to basically encompass the city with a larger square that will include the city, so that, and this larger square will be directly due north, south, east, and west, right? So the question is, do we need the city to be directly due north, south, east, and west? Or do we say it doesn't matter what directions they're facing? The important thing is it has to be the shape of a square. And that's the chiddush over here. That when we're saying that if the city is a square, you don't add corners, it means that you leave it alone. Once it's a square, you leave it alone, even if, the sides are not, directly due north, south, east, and west, but may be like northeast or maybe somewhere in between. That doesn't matter. Once it is a square, you leave it alone. Ma'odatema, I may have thought, liraba biribua olam, I may have thought to add on to the square, to basically draw a larger square around it that would include this square, but the larger square would be directly due north, south, east, and west. Kumash malan, that we leave it alone. Once it's a square, that's all we care about. Once it's a square, we don't care. Weiter. Haya beis echad yotze kmin pigum. If you had one house jutting out of the city like a guard tower, o shnei batim yotzen kmin shnei pigumin, or you have 2 houses jutting out like 2 watchtowers. So we said you basically view it as if you would wrap a string around these these houses that are sticking out, and then basically to extend the square to include these houses. So hashta bais echad amart shnei batim yibaya. 1 second. We said that if it's only one house jutting out, well then that would extend the square of the city. Well then certainly 2 sticking out, we would extend the square of the city to include both of those, right? If even 1 already we're extending the city, certainly if 2 of them are sticking out, we're going to extend the square of the city. So l'tzricha mishtei ruchis. No, the chiddush is that they're not on the same side of the city. You have one, let's say, in the north and one in the south. So, ma'odatema, I may have thought to say, I may have thought to say that we only extend one side. We only extend the size of the city on one side, but not on two different sides. Kamash malan, what the Mishnah is teaching us is that we even extend the city on multiple sides to include anything that might be sticking out from it. Haisa asuya kimin keshes, o kimin gam. So if the city so we said that if the city is the shape of a bow, or the shape of this letter gam, so then we view this bow or this gam as if it was it's a square filled in with houses and courtyards. And then from the outside of the square, we measure 2,000 amas in all directions. Okay? Amr Vuna. Says Rav Huna, Ira asuya kikeshes. Okay, so if you have a city that is like a bow, im yesh bein shnei roshea pachis me'arbas alafim ama modin la min hayeser, v'im lav modin la min hakeshes. So Rav Huna says that if you have a city that is shaped like a bow. Okay, or imagine like a horseshoe or a bow. I don't know what's easier for you to imagine, but whether it's a horseshoe, whether it's a bow, the point is it's some shape. Shape that you have the two ends of it are like lateral. The two ends of it are sort of at the same point, but then they go up and kind of round at the top and come together at the top. So now what we're saying is, if between the two houses at the end of the bow there is less than 4,000 amas, i.e. if you walk a full tchum from one towards the center and a full tchum from the other towards the center, they will overlap at the end. So then we can view this bow-shaped city as if it is all one city. Okay, but if there's more than 4,000 amas, i.e. more than 4,000 amas or more, i.e. 2 complete tchums or more, well then you would be unable to view this bow-shaped city as just one city, and therefore, the 2,000 amas you could walk would basically just start from your front door, right? It wouldn't be considered as if you're in a city where the entire thing is daled amas. So let's say you live all the way at the top of the bow. So then when you leave your front door, the second you leave your front door, that's when you start calculating 2,000 amas. However, if there's less than 4,000 amas between the width, the distance between the two houses at the two different ends of the bow, as long as there's less than 4,000 amas, we can view this all as one city, that this open space is just filled in with houses and chutzers, and once you leave your house at the top of the bow, it doesn't matter. It's like you're walking through the city until you get to the very end of the bow, and at that point the 2,000 amas would begin. But again, if the space between the two houses at the end of the bow was 4,000 amas or more, well then we don't view this as a city anymore. And then if, let's say, you're the guy at the top who lives at the top of the bow, well, the second you leave your house, you left your house and you have 4,000 amas from your house. We don't view it as if everything is filled in. But if there's less than 4,000 amas between the two houses at the end, we just view it as one big city. We view it as, this open space is filled in with houses and courtyards, and the 2,000 amma tchum only begins outside of the bow. Fine. So, Amar Rav Huna Hachi, would Rav Huna really say this? Rav Huna said, Chomas ha'ir shenifritza b'meir v'arbaim v'achas v'shlish. So, but one second, Rav Huna said, let's say you have a city, and the city is a rectangle. So, let's just say it's 10,000 amas from west to east, okay, and 5,000 amas north to south, okay? Now, listen to what happens, Chaver. So, in the middle of the northern wall, there's a breach. I don't know, somehow the northern wall gets knocked down. And not just the northern wall, but then all the houses opposite the northern wall get knocked down, until you basically have this, it almost looks like two cities. You had one big rectangular city, and now the breach does not, we're assuming at this point, that the breach does not go all the way through the city from north to south, but let's say it goes halfway through, okay? So you basically, or let's say 3/4 of the way through. So basically what you have is, once upon a time it was just one wide rectangular city. But then you get a breach in the northern wall, and the breach then pushes its way into the city, so that you basically now have like just a big open area between two sides of the city now. So you have, let's say, the western side of the city, then you have this big breach area where the wall was breached and all the houses were knocked down 3/4 of the way from north to south. And then you pass through this open area, and then you get now to this eastern side of the city. So it's no longer one big contiguous city, it's the western side, a big gap of open area, and now the eastern side. But at this point we're assuming that there's still a connection towards the southern side of the city, i.e. it's almost like a bow, essentially. So it was one big city, and then we kind of cleared away some space in between, in the middle, and now it's like it's a bow. And Rav Huna says that in that case, the distance between the western side and the eastern side, i.e. the size of this cleared out area, needs to be less than 141 1/3 amas. Who can tell me what 141 1/3 is? Well, if you divide it in two, it's 70 2/3. 70 2/3, of course, is the size of a beis sasayim, the size of a karpaf. Now, the assumption is that outside of a city, there is like a karpaf area for people to work, right? Or that the city can use, that it's for the use of the city. So what we're saying is that if between the two sides now of this city, there is, the size of 2 full karpafs between the 2 sides of the city, well then we have to view them as 2 separate cities, 2 separate tchums, and you wouldn't be able to necessarily just carry, to walk from one side straight through to the other. Once you leave one side, it's already going to be like, you're going to start calculating the Tchum Shabbos from there. So, how come Rav Huna is saying that by the bow, we say that there can be up to 4,000 amas between the 2 sides of the bow, yet when it comes to the city that got breached and essentially created the formation of a bow, he's saying that you only have 141 and a third amas. Once it's more than that, then you can no longer, you have to view it as 2 separate Tchum Shabbos between the 2 sides. So why in one case 4,000 and in another case 141 and a third? That's a big difference. So Amar Rabba bar Rav Ula, lo kasha, it's no problem. Kam burachachas, kam mishteruchas. So the Gemara answers, well, actually when it came to the breach, it was mamash a breach from north straight on through to south. So you had this one wide city which actually got breached and made into 2 separate cities. Mamash, you had this one wide city, right? We said it was 10,000 amas wide, and then the northern wall gets breached, but they're clearing out all the houses, mamash, straight through the city, straight through the southern wall. And now you mamash have 2 separate cities that are divided by this breached area. So now that it's 2 separate cities, well then the allowed area is 141 and a third, because each city we view it, so they're 2 separate cities, and a city is given a karpaf area outside of it, surrounding it, for use of the city. Who knows? Maybe that's where they take care of their sanitation. I don't know what they do over there. But then if there is enough space between these 2 newly formed cities to have, for each one to have their own karpaf, well then we view them as 2 separate cities. But if there's less than 2 karpafs worth, i.e. less than 141 and a third amas, well then we could still view it as if it's still one area, one tchum, and therefore you could walk from one city into the next and still be in the same Tchum Shabbos, and the Tchum would only begin outside of both cities. Meaning once you get past both cities. Whereas by the bow, it's not completely breached, it's still attached, right? The bow is still attached at the top. So therefore, that is why you get the larger amount, as long as it's less than 4,000 amas from one end to the other end of the bow, meaning in terms of width. So then we could still view it as one city, and you can walk in that middle area, the open area of the bow, and still be within the tchum of the city, the dalet amas of the city. We view it as if it's filled in with houses and courtyards. So again, Rabba bar Ula, lo kasha kam bruach achas, it depends. If it's only breached on one end, like a bow, well then you get up to 4,000 amas of width. Kan mishteruchis, whereas the breach in the city was actually breached all the way through from north to south, so you're actually left with 2 separate cities, and that is why you have only up to 141 and a third amas in between, before we consider it to be 2 separate tchums. Umay kamash malan, but then the Gemara is not satisfied. What is Rav Huna teaching us? Denostin karpaf lazo v'karpaf lazo, that each of the 2 cities, right, each of the 2 newly formed cities gets its own karpaf, and that as long as there is not enough space for 2 karpafs, we would view it as one Tchum Shabbos. Ha'amra Rav Huna chadazimna. Rav Huna already told us this, so why is he telling us this again? Titnan, as we learn in the Mishnah, nosnin karpaf le'ir div Reb Meir. So Reb Meir has an interesting opinion. Apparently we're going to get to it on Daf Nun Zayin, which is that when calculating the Tchum of a city, you don't calculate it from immediately outside of the city, right? We've been talking about how do we define the dimensions of a city, and we create a square or a rectangle and put the city inside of it, but you still don't start calculating the Tchum Shabbos from immediately outside of that rectangle or square. You actually first surround that rectangle or square with a karpaf, 70 and 2/3 amas, and then you only start counting 2,000 from outside of that karpaf. So, right outside of that surrounding karpaf area. So that is Reb Meir's opinion. Where the Chachamim argue and say, Lo amru karpaf ela bein shtei ayaros. Whereas the Chachamim say, no, karpaf only becomes significant in terms of determining if 2 separate cities are part of the same tchum or not. right? And we're going to have to understand this. Will be machlokas now in a second about are we talking about one karpaf or two karpafs? But the point is that karpaf becomes significant only in determining if two cities are one tchum or not. So let's go weiter. So itmar, and it was stated, Rav Huna Amar karpaf lazo v'karpaf lazo v'chiyah barav Amar enosin ela karpaf echad d'shtein. And Rav Huna says that what the chachamim mean is that each of when you have two cities that are adjacent, so then each city gets an area outside of it the size of a karpaf for its own needs. Okay, and that's 70 2/3 amas. So what we're saying is, in order to determine if you have these two adjacent cities share a Tchum Shabbos or have their own separate Tchum Shabboses, the definition of that is going to be by a karpaf for each city. And Rav Huna says that means that each city gets their own karpaf, and therefore, so if there's 143 1/3 amas between the two cities, enough for each to have their own own mutually exclusive karpaf area, well, then we'll view them as separate in two different Tchum Shabboses. But if there's less than 141, i.e. their karpaf areas 141 1/3, i.e. their karpaf areas will overlap, well then we can view it as one Tchum Shabbos. Whereas Chiyah Barav is a stricter opinion, which is that, no, they only have up to one karpaf, which is 70 2/3 amas. If there's less than 70 2/3 amas, well then it's one Tchum. If it's more than 70 2/3 amas, well then they're separate cities and separate Tchum Shabboses. Okay, fine. So what do we see? So we see that Rav Huna already taught us this, that when you have two adjacent cities, so then we give each one of them a karpaf in terms of determining Tchum Shabbos. So when we have this one city that gets breached in the middle straight through, and now it's essentially two cities, and Rav Huna is saying that in that case they have 141 1/3 amas, well, we already know that because he says that when you have two adjacent cities, you give them 141 1/3. So what's the chiddush by the breach? So the Gemara answers, Tzricha. We need Rav Huna to teach us both cases. If we would learn only about the breach, that Rav Huna says 141 1/3, well, that's because initially before the breach, you were mamish able to walk anywhere in the city, right? You can walk from one end to the other. It was all just one city. It's all considered one dalat amas. You could walk anywhere in the city, and the Tchum Shabbos will only begin outside the entire city. So since you were able to walk anywhere initially, and the Tchum only beginning outside of the city, so even when there's a breach, we're a bit more makil, and we say that we can still consider it to be all one Tchum as long as there is 141 and 1/3 amas or less in that area, in that open area. However, I might think aval hasam emalo, but I might think that when you mamish have two separate cities that they were always viewed as two separate cities, well then maybe it's only going to be one karpaf in between them, and if it's more than one karpaf space in between them, we'd have to view them as two separate tchums. V'yash minun hasam, and if we would only have the case, right? So therefore, kamash malan, that even when it's two separate cities, we still give them 141 1/3 amas, and if it's more than that, then we'll view it as two tchums. But less than 141 1/3, we'll view it as one tchum. V'yash minun hasam, and if we would only know that Rav Huna's opinion is two complete karpafs by the city. So, where am I? I would say, that the reason why Rav Huna gives this more forgiving, this larger amount of two complete karpafs by the two separate cities is because they're mamish two separate cities and they need the space. Again, I don't know if maybe they use it for like sanitation or whatever it is. Like, it's a whole city, right? It's a self-contained city. They need that 70 2/3 amma area. Each one needs their own, and therefore, if there is not enough space for two complete karpafs, well then we're going to view it as one Tchum Shabbos. But maybe in the case of when it was one large city and they seem to manage just fine without that open area which is karpafs, so which we're measuring in terms of karpafs. So they used to be able to manage without this breached area when it was all one city unbreached. Well then, now that the city gets breached, I might think that, well, they were managed just fine without this open area, karpaf area, when it was one city, so maybe we just need to give them one karpaf in order to determine Tchum Shabbos. So emalot tzricha. So that is why we need Rafuna to say that no, even in terms of the breach, we still give them an area of 2 karpafs in order when evaluating if we're going to consider this as 1 Tchum Shabbos or 2 separate Tchum Shabboses. Now says the Gemara, B'chama have ben yeser l'keshes. Okay, so we said that in terms of the width of the bow. So Rafuna said you have up to 4,000 amas of width. What about the sort of length, right? What about from the end of the bow, where you have the 2 houses at the end, and then let's say you're looking at this open area, so from the end, where the final 2 houses are, to the top of the bow, to the point of the bow, or whatever, the top round area of the bow, so how much space can that be? How large can that be? So, Rabba bar Ravuna Amar, said Rabba bar Ravuna, Alpayim Amma. That could be up to 2,000 Amas, 1 Tchum Shabbos. So basically, if the guy at the top of the bow leaves his front door and he's now going to walk to the end of the bow, so, as long as it's less than a full Tchum, so then that would be acceptable. But if he has to walk a complete Tchum in order to get from his house to the end of the bow, well then, we can't view this as one city anymore. We can't just imagine that this is all the open areas filled in with houses and chatzers. We can't do that anymore. Rabba Brei de Rabba bar Ravuna Amar Afilu Yasser Me Alpayim Amma. Rabba Brei de Rabba bar Ravuna says that it can even be more than 2,000 amas. Amar Abaye Kavasa de Rabba Brei de Rabba bar Ravuna Mistavra. Abaye says that it actually makes sense to be like Rava, the son of Rabba Brei de Ravuna. How come? The Ibai Hadar Asi Derech Batim. Well, because Abaye says, look, even if it's more than 2,000 amas, you would still be able to get anywhere you want in the bow by going by way of the houses, right? Because we said as long as the width of the bow is less than 4,000 amas, so then we view it as one city, and you'd be able to, walk anywhere in the open space, and you'd be able to walk by way of the houses to get anywhere you need to go in the bow. So therefore, since you can really walk anywhere, even the height of it doesn't really matter as long as the width is 4,000 amas or less than 4,000 amas. So we said that if there are ruins that are 10 tfachim tall, so that would work in terms of extending the square of the city to include those ruins. My Gedudias, what are these Gedudias? Amr of Yehuda, Shalosh Mechitzes She'enalein Tikra. Okay. So it says of Yehuda, if you have a structure that has 3 walls, even if there's no roof, and certainly if there is a roof, but even if there's no roof, that can count as a structure that we would extend the square of the city to include, or the rectangle, whatever, to include the shape of the city, to include that structure. Ibailu, they want to know, Shtei Mechitzes Ve'eshalein Tikra Ma'u. What if you have 2 mechitzas instead of 3, but it has a roof? We said 3 mechitzas without a roof works. What about 2 mechitzas with a roof? So Tashma, come in here. Elu shemisabrin ima. These are the things that can extend a city. Nefesh sheishba arba amas al arba amas. If you have a grave with a what's the word? I don't know, monument. I don't know, some kind of like a house surrounding the grave. Okay. So, if that house is 4 amas by 4 amas, well then that can extend the boundaries of the city. Ve'hagesher, ve'hakever, sheishban bezdira. Or if you have a bridge or a grave that have some kind of a house for or a graveyard that has some kind of a house for somebody to be guarding either the bridge or the graveyard. Or you have a synagogue. Now, a synagogue is not made for living, it's made for praying. And therefore, it's not going to extend the tchum of the city. But if there is a house in the synagogue for the person who works there to live in, well, then it can extend the boundaries of the city. Interesting, or even a house of Avodah Zarah, if there is a place of worship for Avodah Zarah, if there's a house there for the person who works there to live in, well, that can extend the tchum of the city. Va'oravos, va'otzaros, shabasadeh, and the stables, and the place where you store produce in the fields. Veishba and Bezdira, again, if there's a place for somebody to live in, well then that would extend the tchum of the city. V'aburganin shebesocha, and if you have these little huts in a field, that can also extend the tchum of the city. V'abayis shebayam, if you have a structure, a house on a little island in the sea that is within 70 2/3 amas of the city. Hare elu misabrin ima, so that you can extend the tchum of the city, the boundaries of the city, to include that. Okay, so all these things you can extend the boundary of the city to include them. Ve'elu she'ein misabrin ima, and these are the things that you would not extend the boundaries of the city to include. Nefesh shenifritza mishtei ruchosea elach ve'elach. Let's say you have this grave that has a structure around it, and it got breached on 2 of its sides, so now it only has 2 walls. Ve'agesher ve'akever she'ein lo en bezdira, or if you have a bridge or a grave or a graveyard that do not have any structure for somebody to live in. Uveis akneses she'ein la bezdira l'chazan, and if you have a synagogue that doesn't have a place for the person who works there to live. Uveis avodas kochavim she'ein la bezdira l'komrim, and if you have a place of worship for avodah zarah that does not have a specific house for the person who works there. Va'uravos, va'utsaros, shabasados, and stables and places to collect like grain in the field, she'ein loen bezdira, that do not have a place for somebody to live in. Uvor v'shiach umayra, and a pit or a ditch or a cave. V'gader v'shovach shebesocha, or some kind of a fence and a dovecote that's inside of it. V'abayis shebesfina, or if you have a house that is on a boat. Ein elu misabrin ima. None of these are able to, you would not extend the city to include these things. Fine. Now, here's the important part. Katani mias nefesh shenifritza mishtei ruchosea elach ve'elach. So the important part is that we said that if you have a grave that has like a structure around it, and we say as long as it's 4 amas by 4 amas, so then you can extend the city to include it. However, we said if it got breached on 2 of its sides, so then you can no longer extend the city, the borders of the city, to include it. Now, my love, the Ika Tikra. So we're assuming that we're talking about this structure that has a roof above it, and 2 of the walls got knocked down. So what do we see? We have a structure that has 2 walls and a roof, and we're saying that it does not work. You cannot extend the city to include it. So there we go. We see, so to answer our question, if it has 2 walls and a roof, can you extend the city to include it? The answer is no. So the Gemara says, lo, dileka tikra. The Gemara says, no. Actually, the Bryce is talking about 2 walls with no roof, and that's why you can't extend it. But we really don't know what the halacha would be if it's 2 walls with a roof. Okay? Now the Gemara moves on to just sort of discussing other things that we talked about in that brisa. If you have a house on an island within 70 2/3 amas of the city, what is it fit for that we would say let's extend the city to include it? So Amar Rav Papa, okay, so this house you can use that if you have a boat, you can like store stuff from your boat in that house. Alright. We say that a cave, you would not extend the city to include a cave. Reb Chia said that you would extend the borders of a city to include a cave. So Amar Abaye kshiyesh binyan alpia. So Abaye says that it's talking about where you have a cave with a house at its entrance, and that's why you would include the cave. But v'tepukle mishum binyan gufe. Well, then forget about the cave. We're including the we're extending the tchum to include this house because there's a house there, not because of the cave. So it's talking about, well, the house itself is not big enough. It's not 4 amas by 4 amas, but if you add the cave to it, well, then it'll be large enough. So in that case, we allow, so when the cave is there to extend the size of the house, well, then you can extend the tchum to include this house and cave. Amar Rav Huna, said Rav Huna, interesting. So if you have a bunch of pretty just kind of basic huts made out of like wood and branches and stuff. So so even if you have a bunch of these huts, we don't treat them as a city. I.e., so if you have, let's say, 10 huts together, 10 of these trifin together, well, we wouldn't say that we would calculate the 2,000 amas from, outside of the last hut. No, we don't view it as a city, and therefore, you have dalat amas, maybe your hut might be a shusayachid, depending, I guess, on its configuration, but outside of it, you would start counting your 2,000 amas immediately, even though there are other huts around. Right, it says is the pasuk. So that's that the Yidden camped in the desert. Now, when the Yidden were in the desert, interestingly, they just had they were living in tents, apparently. Which is interesting to think that for such a long time, all these people were living in tents. But they would camp in tents. And Rabbi Bar Bachana says that he saw this area where apparently the Yidden encamped in the Midbar. And Rabbi Bar Bachana says that this size was mamash 3 parsas by 3 parsas. Now 1 parsa is 4 mil. 1 mil is 2,000 amas, i.e. a complete tchum. So now it was 3 parsas. Each parsa is 4 times tchum. And there were 3 of these parsas. So it was an area that was 12 tchums by 12 tchums. So certainly more than 1 tchum Shabbos. Vitanya, and they were in huts over there. They were in tents. Vitanya, we learn in the Brayz, that when they would have to defecate, when they'd have to use the bathroom, so the latrine area of this encampment was not in front of the encampment, and it wasn't to the sides of the encampment, rather it was behind the encampment. So if that's the case, let's say you live all the way at the front of the encampment. Who is that? Was that like Yehuda or something like that? So if you were mamish all the way at the front of the encampment, and it's Shabbos, and you gotta go to the latrine, you gotta go to the bathroom, so you gotta walk all the way from the front of the camp to the outside of the camp, which is pretty far. It's 12 mil. 12 mil, yeah, 3 parsas. So 12,000 amas. So, no, or is it more than that? No, 1 second. 1 mil is 2,000 amas. It's 4 of those in 1 parsa. So that's 2 times 4 is 8,000 times 3, so 24,000 amas. Whatever, it's pretty far to walk, and it's definitely more than a Tchum Shabbos. So now, Rabbi Bar Bachana said that, so this area was pretty big, and we're saying that if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to mamish go outside of the camp, which means that how can you go to the bathroom on Shabbos? Because you're walking more than a Tchum. Now, if we're saying that a temporary hut, you only measure the tchum from right outside the hut, and you don't view it all as like a city, all these huts that are together, well then that basically means that in the Midbar, we wouldn't treat it as a city to say that all of it's considered like dalat amas. Rather, once you leave your hut, you have 2,000 amas. And therefore, and we're saying that nonetheless you could walk outside of the encampment, which would be an issue. So in order for that to make sense, we would have to say that all these huts together actually would form a city, to be all just like 1 dalat amas. So Amalei Rava, so Rava responds to Rav Chizda, Digle Midbar comment. You're talking about the encampment in the Midbar. That since they said that they would travel by word of God, well, command the Kviyah Ludami. God is God has the power to make even huts considered kavua. And therefore, even though they were living in huts in the desert, it was considered a proper city, and you would be able to walk throughout that entire encampment area. But in general, a bunch of huts would not constitute a city. Amr Rav Chinna bar Rav Kahana, Amr Rav Ashi, Im yesham shalish chatzeres shel shnei batim hugbeu. Okay, so it says Rav Chinna bar Rav Kahana in the name of Rav Ashi, that if you have a bunch of huts together, so we said that it wouldn't count as a city, but if there were 3 chutzers in that area, and those chutzers have 2 proper houses in each of them, so then that would be enough to make the area considered a city, and those huts would be within the city, and you'd be able to treat that entire area as a dalat amas. Amar Rav Amar Rav, says Rav Yudah in the name of Rav, Yoshvei tzrifin v'olchim in baris, people who live in huts in the middle of nowhere, and people who travel in deserts, basically like shepherds, people who live a sort of nomadic lifestyle. Chayein einan chaim, interesting. U'neshein uvnein einan shaloim. Wow. So their life is not a life. And Rashi says that that's because they don't enjoy life enough. Right? Rashi says, right, Kemesim, right, we're going to say that it's Kiyosh Vekfaros. In a second, we're going to say it's like they live in graves, that they're like dead people. Fishim Chusar Nana. They live a life devoid of any type of pleasure and enjoyment. Velokin Bruchos B'Zayim Matar, and they're always, open to the elements, winds and rains and storms. Alright, interesting. Okay. So it says of you in the name of Rav, so Yoshvei Tzvifin V'Ochim Midbaros, people who live in huts and in deserts, Chayein Einan Chayim, so their lives are not worth living. U'Nishein Uvnein Einan Shelayin, and their wives and their children are not theirs. Wow. Tanya Namiyach, we also learn in a Brisa, Eliezer Ish Birya Omer, Yoshvei Tzvifin K'Yoshvei Kvarim, people who live in huts are like people who are dead. Wow. Favnoseimu Omer, and it says about their daughters, Aru Shochev Mkol Behema. Wow. Oh my goodness. Cursed is somebody who sleeps with an animal. Yikes. My time, like, what's the deal? Why are we hating on these people? They sound like nice enough people. Ula Amar said, Ula she'ein la'en mechatzaos. So Ula says, well, because they don't have bathhouses. And what this means is that the men don't have anywhere to bathe. So they have to walk far away in order to bathe. And then when the men go to bathe, so improper men may then come to town and sleep with the women there, in which case that creates all sorts of problems. So, and now you can also, in addition to whatever problems that might create, we now don't know whose children belong to who and who the parents are. Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Yochanan says that it's because, well, when the women have to go to the mikveh, so then they would have to go far away in order to find a mikveh, and then they would go with a friend, and then people would kind of find out. And if you have a man who is improper, he might stalk these women on the way and have yichud with them. I suspect that yichud can imply maybe more than just yichud, but and then that can also create issues in terms of not knowing whose children are whose. So because basically you can have situations where men can basically rape these women, so therefore we can't be certain whose children are who. So my binaya, what's the nafkamina between whether it's the men who have to go to the bathhouses or the women who have to go to the mikveh? So you could binaya nahar the samach levesa. Nafkamina is if there is a river that is close to where they are living. So if there's a river, i.e. a place where the women can go to the mikveh and it's close by, well then you don't have to worry about any men stalking them to go when they go to the mikveh, because it's not like they're going in the middle of nowhere. But bathhouses where the men have to go to, they would still have to travel. If the concern is about the men going to the bathhouses, well, they're still going to have to go to the bathhouse far away, in which case the women would be left alone, and improper men can rape them, which would be a problem. That was daf nun hey amud. That was daf nun hey amud aleph and beis. So what do we talk about today? We talk about shapes of cities and how we basically, extend the shape of the borders of a city to include, to make sure that we have an area with 4 90-degree angles that includes the entire city. We talked about a bow-shaped city. We said that the width of it can be up to 4,000 amas, and its length can be any amount. We talked about combining 2 adjacent cities in terms of tchum. Rav Huna says that the amount in between them would be 2 karpavs. Chia Barav says 1 karpav. Talk about huts, that huts do not form a city, even if there's a bunch of them together. If the area where the huts are, there are 3 chutzers that each have 2 proper houses, well then it creates a city, and those huts are going to be considered within that city, and the whole thing would be considered like Daled Amis. And interestingly, we said that in the Midbar, even though it was just a bunch of tents basically, nonetheless it was considered a city because they would travel by word of God, so that was enough to consider it to be a proper city. Cheva, I hope you enjoyed Daf Nun Hey, and have a great day. Peace out.